You know this story. January 1841. A young lawyer in Springfield, Illinois, breaks an engagement 3 weeks before the wedding, and something inside him comes apart. You know his name. What you don't know is whose house he was carried to. For 6 weeks that winter, a grown man could not be left alone with a razor. Friends took turns sitting up with him through the night, and when the worst of it had passed, when he could finally stand a room with the door shut, it was not his law partner's home he returned to, and it was not his roommate's spare bed he slept in for the better part of a year. It was hers. She fed him. She wrote his excuses to the men who needed him in court. She opened her front parlor to the one woman in Springfield he was too ashamed to face, and she stood in the doorway between them until it stopped being unbearable. Her name was Eliza Francis. History remembers the wedding that eventually happened. It has never once stopped to ask who built the room it happened in. Good evening. Let's get into it. Springfield, Illinois, in 1839, was a town that had recently decided to become a capital and had not yet finished the paperwork. Mud streets. A courthouse under construction. Roughly 1,500 people, most of whom read the same 2 newspapers and knew each other's business by breakfast. One of those newspapers was the Sangamo Journal. It was edited by a man named Simeon Francis, a transplant from Connecticut, who had built the paper into the loudest Whig voice in the state. His wife was Eliza. She was 38 years old that year, older than most of the men who filled her front room on any given evening, and she ran a household that had become, without anyone formally deciding it should, the unofficial meeting hall of Springfield's young Whig establishment. Consider what that meant in practice. A newspaper office needed writers. A political party needed a place to argue without an audience of voters watching. A handful of ambitious young men, new to the capital, needed somewhere warmer than a boarding house to spend an evening. The Francis house on the corner of 6th and Adams solved all 3 problems at once, and it solved them because Eliza Francis kept it open. Abraham Lincoln started coming around in 1836, 3 years before the winter that mattered. He was already writing for Simeon's paper by then, some of it signed, most of it not, the kind of anonymous political sniping a newspaper editor is glad to publish and even gladder to deny having commissioned. He was 27 years old, unmarried, riding the legal circuit half the year, and boarding above a store the other half, a man with almost no fixed domestic life of his own. The Francis house gave him one anyway. By most accounts, it was Eliza who made that happen, not Simeon. Simeon wanted a writer. Eliza wanted, by the description of nearly everyone who left a record of her, somewhere for young men without mothers in the room to sit down and be fed. She had no children of her own. Make of that what you will. The record does not explain it, and we should not pretend to. What the record does show is a pattern. Young lawyer arrives in a town he does not belong to yet. Young lawyer is folded, gradually and without much ceremony, into a household that is not his. Young lawyer starts showing up for meals he was never formally invited to, because by then, nobody bothers inviting him anymore. He is simply expected. That was Lincoln's Springfield, for years, before anyone had reason to write any of it down. Nobody in Springfield in 1839 thought to ask where Eliza Francis had come from, because nobody in a town that young ever does. Everybody there had come from somewhere else. That was the entire premise of the place. She had been born in Connecticut, in the same stretch of New England that produced her husband, and the 2 of them had married there before following the same westward current that was pulling half of Simeon's generation out of played-out New England farmland and into the new states, being carved out of the old Northwest Territory. Illinois in the 1830s was still, by the standards of Hartford or New Haven, a frontier. Simeon came for the newspaper business, which was booming in every new state capital that needed a partisan press to argue its case. Eliza came because that is what a wife did, and whatever ambitions or disappointments she carried with her across that distance were not the kind of thing an editor's wife wrote down for anyone else to read. What we know of her comes almost entirely second-hand, filtered through the letters and memoirs of the men who passed through her parlor and thought to mention her, usually briefly, usually in the middle of a sentence about somebody else. She is described, across those scattered mentions, as warm, as direct, as the kind of hostess who did not perform hospitality so much as simply practice it. without much interest in whether anyone noticed. She had no children. In a century that measured a married woman's worth almost entirely by that single fact, this would have been, for most women in her position, a defining absence, the kind of thing referenced obliquely in condolence letters and never discussed directly in polite company. Eliza Francis appears, instead, to have redirected whatever that absence might have hollowed out of a lesser household into the household itself. She did not have children. She had, instead, a rotating population of other people's sons, arriving in a new capital with no mother within 400 miles, and she treated them, by every surviving account, exactly as if that were the same thing. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes the shape of everything that follows. Eliza Francis was not a stranger who happened to have a spare room when Lincoln needed one. She was, by the time the winter of 1841 arrived, already 5 years into the practice of taking in exactly this kind of young man. Lincoln was not an exception to a rule. He was the rule, working as designed, on the one occasion when the historical record happened to be paying close enough attention to notice. Simeon's newspaper gave the household its public purpose. Eliza's temperament gave it its private one. And for the better part of a decade, the two purposes ran together so completely that nobody bothered separating them, including, it seems, Eliza herself. In December of 1839, at a party in Springfield, Lincoln met a young woman, recently arrived from Kentucky, named Mary Todd. She was smart, sharp-tongued, ambitious in a way women of her class were rarely permitted to be out loud, and she was, by the account she gave a friend years later, immediately taken with him. He was less certain. That uncertainty is the entire story. Mary Todd had come to Springfield to live with her sister Elizabeth, who had married into the town's small aristocracy, and she arrived already fluent in the kind of political conversation most women of the period were expected to sit through, rather than join. She could discuss a tariff bill with the same ease she brought to a dance card, and Springfield's young bachelors, Lincoln very much included, found this either intoxicating or alarming, sometimes both at once. For a period that overlapped uncomfortably with Lincoln's own courtship, Mary Todd was also being courted by Stephen Douglas, the ambitious young state legislator, who would go on to spend the next 2 decades as Lincoln's rival, first for Mary's hand, and later, far more consequentially, for the country itself. Nobody in Springfield in 1840 could have known what that rivalry would eventually become. What they could see, at the time, was 2 young men circling the same young woman, one of them a rising political natural with money and polish, the other a self-taught lawyer from a dirt farm who had walked into Springfield 4 years earlier with almost nothing to his name. Mary chose Lincoln. History has spent a great deal of energy trying to explain why, and most of that energy has been wasted, because the honest answer is the one nobody wants. We do not fully know, and neither, in all likelihood, did she. Not with the kind of clarity biographers like to assign after the fact. They courted through 1840. An engagement followed, sometime near the end of that year, though nobody agreed even at the time on exactly when or how formal it was. What everyone did agree on, later, once there was a reason to look back and reconstruct it, was that Lincoln spent the months leading up to New Year's Day 1841 growing steadily less able to function. He missed sessions of the legislature. His law practice, which needed him in court on a schedule, started needing him more than he could give it. Friends who saw him described a man going through the motions of an ordinary week and getting worse at it by the day. There is a particular kind of dread that settles over a person who can feel an obligation approaching and cannot make himself move toward it, and by every surviving account, that is what the final weeks of 1840 looked like on Abraham Lincoln, a man circling his own wedding the way a condemned man circles a court date. On the 1st of January, 1841, the engagement broke. The record does not agree on who ended it. Some accounts have Lincoln backing out, standing up his own bride on a day that may or may not have been the actual wedding date, though that particular detail has been disputed by historians for 150 years and probably always will be. Some accounts have Mary releasing him, sensing correctly that a man in his condition was in no state to be anyone's husband. What every account agrees on is what happened next, because what happened next was too visible to argue about. He collapsed, not figuratively. His law partner at the time, John Todd Stewart, later described him as the most miserable man he had ever seen, living or dead. Lincoln missed the legislative session on the 4th of January entirely, a body he was a sitting member of, which was, for a working politician in a small capital where every absence got noticed and discussed, its own kind of public confession. A local doctor was called. Friends began organizing themselves into shifts, and here is the detail that the popular version of this story tends to skip past, because it is uncomfortable and because it does not fit neatly into a paragraph about heartbreak. The men around him were not worried he would grieve too long. They were worried he would not survive it. Accounts from the period describe razors and knives being quietly removed from any room he was left alone in. That is not a description of sadness. That is a description of a suicide watch, conducted by amateurs in a small town with no hospital equipped to help them, using the only tool available, which was each other. Joshua Speed, the friend who shared living quarters with Lincoln above a Springfield store, gets most of the credit historians assign for getting him through that winter, and he deserves a great deal of it. He shared a bed with Lincoln for years, in the ordinary economical way two unmarried men did in that period, and it was Speed who was physically present most nights. But Speed worked. Speed ran the store below their shared room, and a store does not close itself for 6 weeks because its owner's roommate is unwell. Someone had to take Lincoln during the daylight hours, when Speed could not, and feed him, and keep him occupied, and watch him without appearing to watch him, because a man that fragile can tell when he is being watched, and it makes things worse. That someone was Eliza Francis. The Francis house absorbed him almost entirely for the worst stretch of that winter. He ate there. By some accounts he slept there on and off as well, in a spare room Eliza kept made up, closer to the center of a household with people constantly moving through it than the quiet rooms above Speed's store, where a man alone with his thoughts had entirely too much company of the wrong kind. Think about what Eliza Francis was actually doing, day after day, in the early weeks of 1841. She was managing a newspaper household with a husband whose business depended on political men trusting his home as neutral ground. She was, by every account, doing this without any medical vocabulary for what she was managing. The word for what Lincoln was experiencing would not exist in anything like its modern form for another 80 years. She had no diagnosis to reach for. She had a young man who could not stop talking about his own worthlessness, who by his own later description considered himself the most wretched creature living, and she had a kitchen, a fire, and however much patience the day required. She kept him fed. She kept him occupied with small tasks, the kind of domestic busywork that gives a collapsing mind something smaller than itself to hold on to. And when he was finally able to leave a room without someone walking him to the door, she did not stop. Here is what she was working with, in the language of her century. Lincoln's friends called it his hypo, short for hypochondriasis, a catch-all Victorian term that covered everything from mild low spirits to what a modern clinician would very likely recognize as a major depressive episode with active suicidal ideation. It was not considered a disease with a course of treatment. It was considered a temperament, a weakness of constitution. Some men were simply born carrying, the way another man might be born with weak lungs. There was no ward for it. There was no rest cure with a name. No physician in Springfield qualified to do anything for it beyond bleeding a patient or prescribing rest. And rest was in short supply for a man who could not stop replaying, out loud, to whoever would sit and listen, every failure he believed himself guilty of. Eliza Francis had no framework for what she was doing. She had a young man unraveling in her front room, and she had whatever instinct told her that a person coming apart needs, more than medicine, somewhere warm to sit and somebody willing to stay in the room. That instinct is not in any textbook of the period. It would take the profession the better part of a century to formally agree with her. Some of what we know about the depth of Lincoln's collapse comes from a single letter, written weeks after the worst of it, to his law partner Stewart, who was away in Washington at the time serving in Congress. In it, Lincoln described himself as the most miserable man living, and added that if the misery he carried were distributed evenly across the entire human family, there would not be a single cheerful face left on earth. That letter survives because Stuart kept it. Most of what passed through the Francis household that winter did not survive at all, because nobody involved thought to preserve it. Letters between friends who see each other daily rarely get written in the first place, and the ones that do get written are rarely kept, because nobody imagines, in the moment, that a stranger 180 years later will need them. We know Eliza wrote to people during this period, because other people's letters mention having received word from her. None of those letters have survived. We know she corresponded with Speed, coordinating, by every reasonable inference, who would take Lincoln on which afternoon, who would sit with him through which evening, the ordinary logistics of round-the-clock care that somebody has to manage, even when nobody thinks to write down that they are managing it. That correspondence is gone. It was not the kind of thing anyone thought worth keeping, because at the time, nobody involved understood themselves to be living inside a story historians would spend the next 2 centuries trying to reconstruct from fragments. What we are left with, instead, is a kind of negative space. We know the shape of what must have happened because we can see its edges in the letters that did survive, the ones written by men, mostly to other men, discussing Lincoln's condition and rarely mentioning who was actually managing it day to day. Herndon, Lincoln's later law partner and first serious biographer, spent decades after Lincoln's death interviewing every surviving witness he could find to reconstruct these years. He collected testimony from Speed at enormous length. He wrote to Stuart. He tracked down old Springfield residents decades later and asked them to remember, as best they could, what a dead president had been like as a young man falling apart in a small town nobody outside Illinois had ever heard of. He appears never to have interviewed Eliza Francis directly, or if he did, the record of it did not survive the way his other interviews did. By the time Herndon began his research in earnest, in the 1860s and 1870s, the Francis family had been gone from Illinois for the better part of 2 decades, scattered across 2 more states, difficult to locate and easy to overlook. Herndon was building his account largely from the men who had stayed in Springfield, or who could be reached by letter within the state. A woman on the Pacific coast, 3,000 miles from the archive he was building, was simply harder to reach than a man 3 counties away. And history, when it is being written by the people with the least time and the most subjects to cover, tends to favor whoever is easiest to reach. That is not a conspiracy. It is something quieter and more common than a conspiracy, and in some ways harder to correct for. It is simply what happens to the people who are inconvenient to interview. For roughly a year and a half after the broken engagement, Lincoln and Mary Todd did not speak. Springfield society, small and gossiping as it was, treated the rupture as final. Mary's own family, particularly her sister Elizabeth, who had hosted the courtship in the first place, considered the matter closed and were not sorry about it. What almost nobody in Springfield knew, because it was arranged specifically so that almost nobody would, was that by the autumn of 1842, Lincoln and Mary Todd had begun meeting again. In secret, in Eliza Francis's front parlor. She is the one who arranged it. Every account of the reconciliation that survives, thin as the record is, places Eliza at the center of it, not as a bystander who happened to have a spare room, but as the person who actively engineered the meeting. She invited them both to her house, on separate pretexts. She left them alone together. She gave them a room in a town where being seen together in public would have generated the kind of talk neither of them could afford, hers being the one house where that talk would not start. Read that again, and notice what it required of her. Eliza Francis had spent a year and a half watching a broken man rebuild himself in her own front room. She had fed him through the worst of it, and when the time came, she used her own house, her own reputation, her own name, in a town where reputation was close to the only currency a woman had, to put him back in a room with the woman whose rejection had nearly finished him. There is a second thread running underneath this reconciliation, one that rarely makes it into the popular version of the Lincoln love story, and it runs directly through the Francis household as well. In the late summer of 1842, a series of anonymous letters appeared in the Sangamo Journal, Simeon Francis's own paper, mocking a Democratic state official named James Shields. The letters were sharp, funny, and cruel in the specific way political satire in that period liked to be cruel, written under a fictional persona and clearly intended to humiliate a public man in front of the entire readership of the state's loudest Whig newspaper. Shields, understandably furious and unable to identify his actual tormentors, demanded to know from the editor who had written them. Lincoln had written some of the letters. He had not written all of them. At least one, by most historical accounts, had been written by Mary Todd herself, together with a friend, using the same fictional persona Lincoln had established, the two of them turning a private joke into a public political weapon without fully reckoning with what it would cost the man whose name would end up attached to it. When Shields traced the letters back through Simeon Francis's office, it was Lincoln who stepped forward and claimed sole authorship. He did this, by every account that survives, specifically to protect Mary Todd's reputation, to keep a young unmarried woman's name out of a public feud that had already escalated toward the point of a formal dueling challenge. Shields, insulted beyond the point of a printed apology, challenged Lincoln to a duel. Lincoln accepted, chose broadswords as the weapon on the theory that his considerably longer reach would make the contest less lethal than it sounded, and the two men very nearly killed each other on a sandbar in the Mississippi River before their seconds managed to negotiate a settlement in the final minutes. Notice where this entire episode originated. It began in Simeon Francis's newspaper office. It very nearly got Lincoln killed, defending a woman he was not, at that point, publicly courting, in a household run by the same woman who would, within weeks of the crisis resolving, quietly begin engineering their reconciliation. The Francis household was not a footnote to the Lincoln-Todd courtship. For a period of nearly 2 years, it was the courtship's entire operating theater, its hospital during the collapse, its near-fatal battlefield during the Shields affair, and finally its secret meeting room during the reconciliation that made the marriage possible at all. Almost none of that operating theater's owner survives in the popular telling. The duel gets its own chapter in most Lincoln biographies. Eliza Francis gets a sentence, if that. There is no letter in which she explains why she did any of it. Nobody asked her to explain it at the time, and by the time anyone thought to ask, she was no longer available to answer. They were married on the 4th of November, 1842, at Mary's sister's house, in a ceremony arranged with almost no notice, the kind of quiet, hurried wedding two people plan when they have already spent a year and a half being talked about and would like, for once, not to be. Eliza Francis was not the hostess of that wedding. That honor belonged to Elizabeth Edwards, Mary's sister, whose parlor it happened in. Eliza does not appear to have been in the room at all. She had done her part earlier, in a smaller room, with no ceremony and no guest list, and by the time the actual wedding took place, her job was finished, and the story had moved on without her. It is worth pausing here to ask a question the historical record was never designed to answer, because the men writing it down were not, by and large, in the habit of asking it about the women around them. What did Eliza Francis get, in the end, for any of this? Not money. There is no record of payment, formal or informal, changing hands for 6 weeks of a young man's board and care, or for the use of a front parlor as a courtship's secret headquarters. That was not how the arrangement worked, and nobody involved would have thought to frame it that way. It was neighborliness, extended to the point of exhaustion, in a period and a place where neighborliness was assumed to be its own reward, not credit, in any form that outlasted the year it was earned. Lincoln's own letters from the period thank Speed by name repeatedly. They do not thank Eliza with anything like the same frequency, not because he felt less gratitude, there is no reason to think that, but because the convention of the period did not extend to a woman's domestic labor the acknowledgement it extended to a man's companionship. Speed was a friend. Eliza was, in the language available at the time, merely a hostess. The word did enormous, unfair work in that century, flattening essential, difficult, sustained labor into something that sounded like arranging flowers. Not a place in the story that outlasted her own lifetime. She died in 1876. By 1890, when the first serious full-length biographies of Lincoln began appearing, drawing heavily on Herndon's decades of collected interviews, the Francis name appeared, when it appeared at all, as a location rather than a person. The Francis house, the the Francis parlor. A stage set the story passed through on its way to somewhere more important, its owner reduced to the furniture inside it. This is not a uniquely cruel thing that was done to Eliza Francis specifically. It is the ordinary mechanism by which 19th-century domestic labor, performed almost entirely by women, gets filed away in the historical record as scenery rather than action. She is not unusual in having this happen to her. She is unusual only in how much, by any fair reading of the surviving evidence, she actually did, measured against how little of it made it into the version of the story anyone was ever taught. Here is where the record thins, and it thins the way it always does for women whose usefulness ended once the men around them were fixed. Simeon Francis sold the Sangamo Journal in 1855, and the family moved west, eventually settling in Oregon, then further still, to California. The move was, in its own way, typical of the period. Part of a broader westward drift of Whig-aligned newspapermen chasing new territories and new papers to build. But it also had the practical effect of removing the Francis household almost entirely from the geography of Lincoln's rising political career. Lincoln's political rise through the 1850s happened almost entirely without the Francis household in it. The debates with Douglas that made him a national figure happened in Illinois, but by then, Simeon and Eliza were in Oregon, building a new paper in a territory that had only just become a state, 4,000 miles from the political stage their old border was climbing. He became a national figure. He became president. He was assassinated in 1865, in a box at Ford's Theater, in a story that has been told and retold in exhaustive forensic detail for 160 years. Eliza Francis was not in that box. She was not in Washington. She was, by 1865, an old woman on the Pacific coast, 3,000 miles from the presidency she had, in a very real sense, helped make possible by keeping one particular young man alive and married to the right woman 2 decades earlier. There is a coda to this, and it is a small one, and it is the kind of detail that survives almost by accident. In 1861, shortly after taking office, President Lincoln appointed Simeon Francis to a position with the Army Paymaster's Department in Oregon, and later helped arrange further government work for him on the Pacific coast as the family's fortunes in the newspaper business faded. It was not a large post. It was not a famous one. It was the kind of appointment a president makes for an old friend who needs steady work and asks for nothing more than that. Lincoln did not forget the Francis family. He simply never explained, publicly or in any letter that survives, exactly what he was thanking them for. Think about the asymmetry embedded in that single fact. Lincoln, by 1861, was arguably the most powerful man in the country, with an entire federal government's worth of patronage at his disposal, and out of everyone he might have rewarded, he found a place for Simeon Francis specifically. That is not nothing. That is a president remembering, deliberately, a debt incurred 20 years earlier in a Springfield parlor. But the appointment went to Simeon. The letters of gratitude, such as they were, went to Simeon. The name attached to the government position was Simeon's. Whatever debt Lincoln felt he owed that household, he settled it, as the century required him to, with the husband, because the husband was the one whose name the law and custom of the period recognized as the household's. Eliza Francis died in San Francisco in 1876, 11 years after the man she had once kept alive through a Springfield winter was carried into a boarding house across the street from a theater and did not come out of it. She was 75 years old. There is no biography of Eliza Francis. There is no statue, no historical marker on the corner of 6th and Adams in Springfield, no line in the standard Lincoln chronologies that reads anything like nursed him back from the edge of it. What there is, instead, is a scattering of letters written by other people, mentioning her the way you mention furniture. Present, useful, unremarked upon. Lincoln himself, in the one surviving letter where he describes the winter of 1841, in his own words, writing to his law partner about being the most miserable man living, does not name her either. He names the feeling. He does not name the room he was in when he survived it, or the woman who kept the door of that room open for as long as it took. Consider what that omission actually costs. We have, preserved under glass in a museum in Washington, the exact chair Lincoln was sitting in when he died. We know the make of the rocking chair, the type of upholstery, the manufacturer. We do not know, with any precision, which room in the Francis house he slept in during the 6 worst weeks of his life, because nobody thought the room was worth writing down. A nation remembers where a man died. It rarely bothers to remember where he was kept alive. Contrast the 2 winters. In 1841, a private collapse in a private parlor, kept alive by a woman with no medical vocabulary and no expectation of thanks. In 1865, a public collapse in a public theater, catalogued down to the stitching on a pair of gloves, preserved, insured, lit correctly, and visited by millions of people a year who know the make of the rocking chair and could not tell you the Francis family existed. One winter produced a museum. The other produced silence, and the silence has held for 180 years. There are questions about Eliza Francis that this account cannot answer, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. We do not know what she said to Lincoln, in any specific words, during those 6 weeks. No transcript exists, no diary entry survives in her own hand, describing the conversations that must have taken place across a kitchen table, night after night, with a man convinced of his own worthlessness sitting across from her. Everything we can say about the texture of that care is inference, built from the shape of the outcome, a man who did not die that winter, working backward toward the kind of daily, patient labor that outcome would have required. We do not know what it cost her, privately, to watch a young man she had fed and sheltered come apart in front of her, night after night, for 6 weeks, with no professional to call and no certainty that her own care would be enough. Women of her generation were not encouraged to record that kind of cost. The domestic ledger she was keeping, if she kept one at all, has not survived. We do not know with certainty what she said to Lincoln and Mary Todd when she engineered their reconciliation, whether she offered them any counsel beyond the simple gift of a private room, whether she believed the marriage was a good idea, or simply believed that 2 unhappy people deserved the chance to find out for themselves. The record is silent on her opinion, because nobody at the time thought her opinion was the part of the story worth preserving, and we do not know, finally, whether she ever thought of any of this as remarkable. It is entirely possible that Eliza Francis lived out the rest of her life regarding the winter of 1841 as simply one difficult season among many, one young man among the many young men who had passed through her parlor over the years, no more or less significant than the others, and that the outsized importance historians would later be tempted to assign to it would have struck her, if she had lived to read it, as faintly absurd. She was not, so far as the record shows, a woman inclined towards self-mythology. She kept a house open. People came through it. Some of them needed more than others. She gave what was needed, and then the moment passed, and she moved on to whatever the next day required. That, perhaps, is the most honest thing this account can say about her. More honest than any claim to have recovered her hidden interior life. She may never have thought of herself as a hidden figure at all. That framing is ours, built a century and a half later, out of a need to correct a record that never thought to include her properly in the first place. Whether she would have wanted the correction is a question the record cannot answer, and we should be careful about answering it for her. Springfield, Illinois, still has a version of the corner where the Francis house once stood. The building itself is gone, replaced decades ago by something the town needed more than it needed to preserve a woman's front parlor. There is no plaque. What survives of Eliza Francis fits, by any generous estimate, into a single paragraph in the footnotes of other people's biographies. A newspaper editor's wife, useful to have known. The house where the Lincolns reconciled, historians will note, almost as an aside, before returning to the marriage itself, the presidency, the war, the theater, the things that were considered the actual story. She kept a man alive through the worst winter of his life, using nothing but a spare room, a dinner table, and whatever it is that lets one person sit with another person's collapse without flinching from it. She then spent her own front parlor's reputation putting that same man back in a room with the woman who very nearly finished what the winter started. Along the way, her husband's newspaper office became the birthplace of the one episode in Lincoln's early life that came closest to killing him by a bullet rather than his own hand, a near duel fought to protect the same woman Eliza would later help him marry. He went on to save a country. She went on to be a sentence, if she is mentioned at all. There is no plaque on the corner of 6th and Adams. There was never a room to seal shut, no dress to bury in a wall, nothing to burn 70 years later and call it closure. There was only a woman who showed up for 6 weeks in the worst winter of a stranger's life, and then again for a year and a half after that, and who left behind, when she finally died in a city 3,000 miles from where any of it happened, nothing you can point to and call hers. The chair he died in sits behind glass, correctly lit, in a museum that receives visitors by the millions. The kitchen where he was kept alive does not exist on any map. That is not an accident of history. It is what history does, reliably, to the rooms where the actual work gets done, versus the rooms where the ending finally arrives. One kind of room gets remembered, the other kind gets built over, and the woman who kept it warm gets folded, a sentence at a time, into somebody else's story, until eventually she is not even a sentence. She is a name in a footnote, attached to a house that no longer stands, on a corner nobody visits, in a story everyone already thinks they know. You knew his name before this video started. Now you know hers. That is the whole of what this story can give her back. Not a monument, not a plaque, just a name, said out loud, in a story that for 180 years has managed to tell itself without it.